The town of Brookfield was small, but simmered with unspoken tensions. Its streets wound through a patchwork of neighborhoods that felt worlds apart despite being only blocks away. On one side, the sidewalks were lined with pristine lawns and bright white fences. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. On the other, cracked pavement led to dilapidated buildings, and the ever-present hum of resilience from the community that lived there. Leona Walker was a beacon in Brookfield's underserved side. She ran the local youth center, where children came to escape the harsh realities of their environment. Her warmth was infectious, her smile disarming. Every morning, she stood at the center's doorway, greeting each child by name as they filed in, their laughter momentarily drowning out the world's injustices. Inside, the walls were painted with murals of hope, each brushstroke a testament to the center's mission to inspire dreams bigger than the town's confines. Leona wasn't naive to the barriers her community faced. She had lived them. She saw the systemic neglect and the crumbling infrastructure, the underfunded schools, and the pervasive distrust between the community and those sworn to protect it. But she believed in change, and she believed that change began with people. Across town, Officer James Rowe patrolled with a sharp eye and a heart hardened by years of reinforcing his own prejudices. To many in Brookfield, Rowe was emblematic of the town's deep-seated issues. He wore his badge with an air of superiority, a symbol not of protection but of unchecked power. As his patrol car rolled through the streets near the youth center, his gaze lingered on the children playing basketball, their shouts of joy grating against his perception of order. That day, Rowe's partner, Officer Miller, tried to lighten the mood during their patrol. "This side of town isn't so bad," Miller remarked, watching a group of teenagers pick up litter from the sidewalks. But Rowe snorted, his disdain barely concealed. "You can clean up all you want, but you can't polish dysfunction," he replied, shaking his head. At the youth center, Leona was in the middle of a workshop with a group of teenagers, including Malik, one of her brightest students. They were brainstorming ideas for a community project to bridge the gap between the town's divided neighborhoods. Malik's passion burned brightly as he shared his thoughts, his words capturing the room's attention. "We can't just keep talking about change," Malik said, his voice steady. "We have to do something. What if we start with a town hall? Bring everyone together, black, white, whoever, and make them listen." Leona's face lit up. "That's a brilliant idea, Malik. Change starts with conversation, and conversation starts with courage." The idea of a town hall meeting quickly gained traction, and plans were set in motion. Flyers were printed, social media posts were made, and excitement buzzed through the center. Yet, not everyone was thrilled about the prospect. Word spread fast in Brookfield, and soon, the whispers of troublemakers stirring the pot reached Rowe. By the evening, Rowe's patrol car slowed as he passed the youth center. The sound of music and laughter spilled onto the street, a stark contrast to the heavy silence he preferred. Pulling over, he stepped out of the car and strode toward the building, his presence casting a shadow over the bright energy inside. Leona greeted him at the door, her voice firm but polite. "Good evening, Officer Rowe. Can I help you with something?" Rowe's gaze swept the room, landing on Malik and the other teens. "Just checking in. Heard there was a lot of noise coming from here. We wouldn't want to disturb the peace, now would we?" Leona met his eyes, unflinching. "What we're doing here is building peace, Officer Rowe. You're welcome to join us if you'd like to contribute." Her words carried a weight that unsettled him, though he masked it with a thin smile. "Just make sure it stays peaceful," he said before turning to leave. As he walked away, Malik stepped beside Leona. "Why do people like him hate us so much?" he asked softly. Leona placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "See her, now it. They fear what they don't understand. But it's not about their hate. It's about our love for ourselves, our community, and our future. That's what they'll never take from us." That night, Leona sat in her modest office, penning her opening remarks for the upcoming town hall. Outside, the streets of Brookfield remained divided, but inside her heart, she carried hope. Little did she know, the ripples of her efforts would soon collide with a storm she could never have anticipated. The morning of the town hall meeting dawned gray and cold, the sky blanketed in low-hanging clouds. Despite the weather, Leona felt a sense of purpose as she prepared for the day. She sat at her desk, carefully reviewing her speech. The words she had written felt strong but measured, a call for unity and understanding in a town where division had long been the norm. Darius arrived early, bringing a tray of coffee and pastries to calm her nerves. "You've got this, Leona," he said with a warm smile. "If anyone can make them listen, it's you." Across town, Officer Rowe was having a very different morning. Seated in the break room at the precinct, he scrolled through social media posts about the town hall. Comments ranged from enthusiastic support to outright hostility. The ones that stung the most were the ones targeting him directly. "This Leona Walker thinks she can paint us all as villains," Rowe muttered to Officer Miller, who was quietly sipping his coffee. Miller hesitated before responding. "Maybe it's worth hearing her out. If people are this upset, maybe we should be asking why." Rowe shot him a glare. "Don't start with that. These people don't want solutions, they want a scapegoat. And I'm not going to stand there and be disrespected." By mid-afternoon, the community center was bustling with activity. Volunteers arranged rows of folding chairs, set up a podium, and tested the microphone. Residents began trickling in, filling the room with a mix of anticipation and tension. The audience was diverse, but the invisible lines of division were palpable. Families from the wealthier side of town sat stiffly, their eyes scanning the room with suspicion, while the center's regulars filled the front rows with an air of defiance. Leona stood backstage, her heart pounding. Renee joined her, giving her a quick hug for encouragement. "Remember," Renee said softly, "this isn't just about today. This is about planting seeds for tomorrow." The meeting began with a local pastor offering an opening prayer, followed by brief remarks from a city council member who avoided taking a strong stance on anything. Finally, it was Leona's turn. She stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. The murmurs in the crowd quieted as she began to speak. "I stand before you today not as someone with all the answers, but as someone who believes in the power of questions," Leona said. "Why does our town feel so divided? Why do some of us feel unsafe in our own neighborhoods? And what can we do, together, to change that?" Her words were met with scattered nods and murmurs of agreement. She spoke about the disparities in funding for schools, the lack of investment in certain neighborhoods, and the need for accountability from those in positions of power. Each point landed heavily in the room, drawing visible reactions from the crowd. Rowe, seated near the back with a few other officers, crossed his arms tightly over his chest. As Leona spoke about the mistrust between the community and the police, his jaw clenched. Finally, Rowe couldn't contain himself. He stood up abruptly, his voice cutting through the room. "Excuse me, Ms. Walker, but are you suggesting that the police are to blame for all the problems in this town?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the confrontation. Leona maintained her composure, her gaze steady. "I'm suggesting that we all have a role to play, Officer Rowe, and that includes holding each other accountable." Rowe's face flushed with anger. "Accountable? You mean demonizing the people who put their lives on the line for this community? People like me?" Before Leona could respond, Malik stood up. "People like you don't protect us. You target us." The tension in the room boiled over. Voices rose as residents argued, some defending Rowe, others rallying behind Malik. The officers in the back exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene. Leona raised her hands, trying to regain control. "Please," she said, her voice firm but calm. "This isn't about us against them. This is about all of us finding a way forward." But the moment had already turned. Rowe stormed out of the building, his boots echoing against the tile floor. Outside, the cold air stung his face as he paced angrily. He felt humiliated, exposed, and enraged that this woman and her supporters dared to challenge him. Minutes later, Leona stepped outside to clear her head. She found herself face to face with Rowe, who was leaning against his patrol car. His expression was cold, his eyes burning with resentment. "What do you want, Officer Rowe?" she asked, her voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a bucket of ice water from the back of his car. a prop left over from a community event the department had hosted, and dumped it over her head without warning. The shock of the freezing water stole her breath, but Leona didn't flinch. She stood there, drenched, her gaze locked on his. Around them, people began to spill out of the center, phones raised, capturing the moment. The silence was deafening. Rose smirked and turned to leave, but the murmurs of disbelief quickly turned to shouts of outrage. Malik rushed to Leona's side, draping his jacket over her shoulders. The crowd surged forward, their anger palpable, but Leona raised a hand to stop them. "This isn't the answer," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "He wants us to lose control. We won't give him that satisfaction." As Rose drove away, the video of the incident was already being shared across social media. By nightfall, it had gone viral, sparking debates, outrage, and a movement that would soon engulf the entire town. For Leona, the battle had just begun. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was on every social media platform, drawing reactions from across the nation. Comments flooded in, with people expressing shock, outrage, and disbelief. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of systemic racism in America. The footage of Officer Rowe pouring ice water on Leona Walker became an undeniable symbol of the town's deep-seated divide. The following morning, Leona woke to dozens of missed calls and messages. Darius arrived early, his face tense as he held up his phone. "You're trending everywhere, Leona. It's all over Twitter, Facebook, everything." Leona rubbed her temples. The weight of the moment was crushing. "This isn't the kind of attention I wanted, Darius," she said quietly. "This is about more than me. It's about the whole community." At the police station, Rose sat in the chief's office, arms crossed defiantly. Chief Andrews was a middle-aged man with a practiced poker face, but even he couldn't hide his frustration. The incident had thrown the department into chaos, with calls pouring in from journalists and angry citizens. "James," Andrews began, his tone measured, "you've put us in a very difficult position. The optics of this are terrible." Rose scoffed. "Optics? I did nothing wrong." She provoked me, stirring up anti-police sentiment. Andrews leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You're suspended pending an internal review. Turn in your badge and gun." Rose's face twisted with anger. "Suspended? For what? A bucket of water? This is ridiculous." Andrews didn't flinch. "This is non-negotiable, James. Turn them in." Rose slammed his badge on the desk and stormed out. In the hallway, Officer Miller approached him hesitantly. "James, this is serious. Maybe it's time to—" "Don't," Rose snapped, cutting him off. "Don't even start." Meanwhile, outside the community center, a group of residents gathered, holding handmade signs that read, "Justice for Leona" and "End Police Abuse." Malik was among them, megaphone in hand, leading chants. His voice carried through the chilly morning air, drawing more people to join. Inside, Leona stood by the window, watching the growing crowd. Renee entered the room, holding a steaming cup of tea. "They're here for you, you know," Renee said softly, "because you give them hope." Leona shook her head. "This isn't just about me, Renee. It's about all of us. But I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry this." Renee placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone." The protests intensified as the day wore on. More people arrived, chanting and holding signs. Cars honked in support as they drove by. Malik, standing on a makeshift platform, delivered a fiery speech. "They think they can silence us with humiliation and fear," he shouted. "But we're still here, and we're not backing down." The energy of the crowd was electric, but tensions ran high. Across the street, a smaller group of counter-protesters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Support the police" and "Stop the division." Arguments broke out between the two groups, and officers were stationed nearby to keep the peace. By evening, Leona found herself in a meeting with the mayor and other community leaders. The mayor, a pragmatic man with a polished demeanor, was visibly uncomfortable. "Leona, I understand your concerns, but we need to approach this carefully. The town is already on edge." Leona's patience was wearing thin. "Carefully? Mayor, Your careful approach is why nothing ever changes. This isn't about being careful. It's about doing what's right. The mayor sighed. I'll authorize an independent investigation into the incident, but I need your help to calm things down. Leona looked him straight in the eye. I'll calm things down when I see real accountability. That night, the streets were alive with activity. Protesters lit candles in a vigil outside the community center, their flames flickering in the cold wind. Songs of resilience and hope filled the air as speakers took turns addressing the crowd. Leona stood quietly at the back, absorbing the moment. Darius approached her, his voice low. The press wants a statement, Leona. What do you want to say? She took a deep breath, stepping forward to face the cameras. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of centuries of injustice. This isn't about one officer or one incident, she began. This is about a system that has failed us for far too long. It's about a community that deserves to be heard, respected, and valued. And we will not stop until that happens. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy renewed. But in the shadows, Ro watched from his car, his face a mix of anger and unease. His world was unraveling, and for the first time, he felt the consequences of his actions bearing down on him. As the night wore on, the town of Brookfield stood at a crossroads, its divisions laid bare for all to see. The fight for justice had begun, and there was no turning back. The morning after Leona's powerful statement, Brookfield woke up to a town transformed. The streets near the community center were alive with activity. News vans parked in rows, protesters setting up tables with petitions, and locals handing out coffee and pastries to keep the energy alive. What had started as a local incident had grown into something far bigger. The town was now a microcosm of the national conversation on systemic racism, and all eyes were on it. Inside the community center, Leona sat at a long table surrounded by community leaders, activists, and a few members of the clergy. Darius stood at her side, taking notes as ideas flew around the room. "We need to keep the momentum going," said Reverend Davis, an older man with a deep, resonant voice. "This is our chance to shine a light on more than just this one incident. We need to talk about the schools, the housing issues, the lack of opportunities. But we also need to be strategic," Renee added, her voice calm but firm. "If we don't focus, they'll twist this into chaos and paint us as the problem." Leona listened intently, her hands clasped in front of her. "We focus on accountability," she said finally. "Officer Rowe's actions were a symptom, not the disease. We push for real reform, starting with an independent investigation into the police department." The group nodded in agreement. Nalit, sitting near the end of the table, raised his hand. "And we make it clear this is a peaceful movement. No matter what they say about us, we don't give them a reason to dismiss us." Meanwhile, at the police department, tensions were simmering. Rowe's suspension had created a ripple effect. Some officers supported the decision, while others felt it was an overreaction. The division was palpable, especially between Rowe and Officer Miller, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his partner's behavior. "You think this is just going to blow over?" Rowe asked Miller, his voice dripping with frustration. Miller hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think things have to change, James. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us." Rowe scoffed, his anger masking a growing sense of unease. "Spare me the lecture. You don't know what it's like to be the one everyone's pointing fingers at." Miller didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Rowe's isolation was growing, and he felt it. That afternoon, the mayor held a press conference in front of City Hall. Flanked by the police chief and a few city officials, he addressed the growing unrest. "We are committed to ensuring that justice is served and that every member of this community feels safe and respected," the mayor said. "To that end, we will be launching an independent investigation into the police department, as well as reviewing our policies and procedures." The announcement was met with cautious optimism from some and skepticism from others. Outside City Hall, protesters chanted, their voices carrying over the mayor's words. Among them was Malik, holding a megaphone. "This is just the beginning," Malik shouted to the crowd. "We need to keep the pressure on. They think they can pacify us with empty promises, but we won't stop until we see real change." Back at the community center, Leona received a call from a prominent journalist who wanted to feature her in a national news segment. It was an opportunity to amplify the movement, but it also meant opening herself up to greater scrutiny. Darius encouraged her to do it. "You've already put yourself out there," he said. "The world needs to hear your voice, Leona." That evening, Leona sat in her living room, preparing for the interview. Renee joined her, helping her go over talking points. The weight of the moment was heavy, but Leona remained resolute. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about the truth. And the truth needs to be louder than the lies." While Leona prepared to speak to the nation, Ro was grappling with his own fallout. Alone in his small, dimly lit home, he scrolled through the comments on social media. Many supported him, calling him a victim of cancel culture, but just as many condemned him. His teenage son, Jason, stood in the doorway, watching his father with a mixture of disappointment and fear. "Dad," Jason said hesitantly, "why did you do it?" Ro looked up, startled. "Do what?" "The water," Jason said. "Why did you pour it on her?" Ro hesitated, his usual bravado faltering. "You don't understand. She was trying to make me look bad." Jason frowned. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to be mean." The words stung more than Ro expected. Jason turned and left, leaving his father to sit alone with his thoughts. The next day, the protest grew even larger. People from neighboring towns joined in, bringing signs and supplies. Malik and other young activists set up a stage and organized speakers. The energy was electric, but the tension was undeniable. Police officers stood in a line nearby, their presence a constant reminder of the fragile peace. Leona took the stage in the afternoon, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," she said. "It's about building a better future. For our children, for our neighbors, and for ourselves. We will not be silenced, and we will not be ignored." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants of "justice for Leona" echoing through the streets. As night fell, the candles of another vigil illuminated the streets. The town was alive with hope, anger, and determination. Leona stood at the center of it all, a reluctant but unwavering leader. Brookfield was changing, and though the road ahead was uncertain, the community was ready to fight for a better tomorrow. The dawn brought a chilling wind to Brookfield, but it did little to cool the fervor that had gripped the town. The streets near the community center were more crowded than ever. Protesters camped out with signs, chanting slogans of unity and justice. Across the street, a smaller but equally vocal group of counter-protesters gathered, their signs declaring support for Officer Rowe and denouncing the growing movement. The divide was no longer confined to the town's history. It was now front and center, out in the open for the world to see. Leona stood on the community center steps, watching the scene unfold. Darius joined her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "It's getting ugly," he said, nodding toward the shouting matches erupting between the two groups. Leona took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "It's always been ugly, Darius. Now people can't ignore it anymore." Inside the community center, Malik and a group of young volunteers worked tirelessly, organizing supplies for the protesters and coordinating speaking schedules. Malik's energy was infectious, but even he couldn't hide his frustration. "They keep calling us troublemakers," he said, showing Leona his phone. "Look at this. People saying we're just making things worse." Leona placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Change always feels uncomfortable to those who benefit from the way things are. Don't let their words distract you. Focus on what we're building." Meanwhile, at the police station, the tension among officers had reached a boiling point. The department was split, with some quietly supporting the protests and others doubling down on their loyalty to Rowe. Chief Andrews called an emergency meeting, his face lined with stress. "We can't afford any more incidents," Andrews said, addressing the room. "The situation outside is volatile, and we need to de-escalate it. I want all of you to remember that your actions represent this department." Rowe, still suspended but present at the meeting, couldn't hold back his anger. "De-escalate? They're the ones causing all this chaos. Why aren't we shutting it down?" Andrews fixed him with a hard stare. "You're not helping, James. You've done enough. The room fell silent, the weight of Andrew's words hanging in the air. Roe clenched his fists but said nothing, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. Outside, the protests continued to grow. The arrival of national media brought even more attention, with reporters interviewing residents and documenting the events. Leona agreed to speak with a major network, her calm and composed demeanor shining through as she articulated the movement's goals. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," she told the interviewer. "It's about holding systems accountable and creating a community where everyone feels safe and valued. That starts with acknowledging the pain and injustice that have been ignored for too long." The interview aired later that evening, drawing widespread praise. But it also made Leona a target for those who opposed her message. Anonymous threats began flooding her phone and email, warning her to back down. Darius was the first to notice her growing unease. "You're not thinking about quitting, are you?" he asked her one evening as they worked late at the center. Leona shook her head, her eyes tired but determined. "No, but I won't lie, it's scary. I knew this would be hard, but I didn't expect it to get so personal." Darius leaned forward, his voice firm. "They're trying to scare you because they know you're winning. Don't let them take that from you." As the days passed, the conflict escalated. One afternoon, during a particularly heated protest, a counter-protester threw a glass bottle into the crowd, shattering dangerously close to Malik. The sound of the impact silenced the chants, and for a moment, it seemed chaos might erupt. But Leona stepped forward, her voice ringing out over the tense silence. "This is not who we are," she said, addressing the protesters. "We are here to build, not destroy. Let's show them our strength by staying united and peaceful." Her words defused the situation, and the crowd began chanting again, louder and more resolute than before. The counter-protester was escorted away by police, and the moment became a turning point for the movement, solidifying its commitment to nonviolence. At the same time, Roe's isolation deepened. His former allies began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with the growing backlash against him. At home, his relationship with his son, Jason, grew even more strained. One evening, Jason confronted him again. "Why can't you just admit you were wrong?" Jason asked, his voice shaking with emotion. "Do you even care what this is doing to us?" Roe, caught off guard, struggled to find an answer. "It's not that simple," he said finally. "I was just defending myself." Jason shook his head. "You poured water on her, Dad. That wasn't defending yourself. That was just cruel." The words lingered long after Jason left the room, leaving Roe to wrestle with his guilt and denial. Back at the community center, Leona and her team finalized their plans for the next phase of the movement. They decided to hold a unity march, inviting residents from all sides of the issue to join in a show of solidarity. It was an ambitious idea, and not everyone believed it would work. "You think they'll march with us?" Malik asked skeptically. "After everything that's happened?" Leona smiled faintly. "Not all of them, but some will. And sometimes, the few steps in the right direction are all you need to start something bigger." The march was scheduled for the following weekend, and the days leading up to it were filled with anticipation and anxiety. Flyers were distributed, social media posts went viral, and volunteers worked around the clock to ensure everything was ready. Leona spent her evenings practicing her speech, her words carrying the weight of a town's hopes and fears. As the weekend approached, Brookfield stood on the brink of a moment that could either deepen its divisions or begin to heal them. The battle lines had been drawn, but the fight for justice was far from over. Leona, though wary, remained steadfast, knowing that the strength of the community would determine what came next. The morning of the Unity March dawned with an uneasy stillness. The sky was clear, the air crisp, but the weight of anticipation hung heavy over Brookfield. Leona arrived early at the community center, dressed in a simple navy coat and scarf. Her team was already hard at work, organizing water bottles, signs, and pamphlets for the marchers. Malik was in high spirits, directing volunteers with a megaphone in one hand and a clipboard in the other. "Today's the day, Ms. Walker," Malik said as he approached her, a wide grin on his face. "Are you ready?" Leona smiled, though her nerves were palpable. "I'm ready, Malik. But it's not about me, it's about all of us." By mid-morning, The marchers began gathering at the starting point near the community center. Families, students, clergy members, and activists arrived in droves, carrying signs with messages like "Justice for All," "Accountability Now," and "Brookfield United." Leona was heartened to see the diversity of the crowd. While the majority were from her side of town, a few residents from wealthier neighborhoods had also shown up, including a young couple pushing a stroller. As the crowd grew, the tension in the air became more pronounced. Across the street, a line of police officers stood watch, their presence a stark reminder of the town's divisions. Some counter-protesters had also gathered, their signs reading "Support Law Enforcement" and "In the Chaos." Leona noticed Officer Rowe among them, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Darius approached her with an update. "We've got over 500 people here already," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and worry. "It's going to be big, Leona. Bigger than we expected." Leona nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll lead with love and strength." At noon, Leona stepped onto the makeshift stage at the starting point. The crowd quieted, their attention focused on her. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Today, we march for justice. We march for unity. We march because we believe in a better Brookfield. A Brookfield where every voice matters, where every person feels safe and valued. This march is not about division. It's about coming together to create a future we can all be proud of." Her words were met with cheers and applause, the crowd's energy surging. Malik took the microphone next, his fiery passion igniting the group. "We're here to show them that we won't back down. We're here to show them that peace doesn't mean silence, and strength doesn't mean violence. Let's make history today." With that, the march began. The crowd moved through the streets of Brookfield, their chants echoing off the buildings. "What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now." The sound was powerful, a collective roar of determination. As the march wound through the town, some residents watched from their windows, their faces a mix of curiosity, support, and discomfort. A few joined in, stepping out of their homes to walk alongside the group. Others remained behind their curtains, unwilling to engage. The counter-protesters grew louder as the march approached their position near the police station. Some shouted insults, while others waved their signs aggressively. A tense standoff seemed inevitable, but Leona had anticipated this. She moved to the front of the march, her presence a calming influence. "Keep walking," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Don't stop. Don't engage." The marchers followed her lead, their chants drowning out the counter-protesters. The police officers standing guard exchanged uneasy glances, their hands resting on their belts. Among them, Officer Miller watched with a conflicted expression. He had been quietly supportive of the march, but knew his role demanded neutrality. As the march reached its final destination, a large park near the town center, the crowd gathered around a stage set up for the closing speeches. Leona took the microphone again, her voice carrying over the sea of faces. "Today, we showed this town, this state, and this nation that change is possible," she said. "But this is just the beginning. Our march doesn't end here. It continues in the conversations we have, the actions we take, and the love we show to one another." The applause was thunderous, and Leona felt a swell of hope. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, she couldn't ignore the simmering tension. Across the street, Rowe watched the scene unfold, his face dark with resentment. As the crowd began to disperse, he approached a group of counter-protesters, his voice low but urgent. "They think they've won," he said, "but this isn't over." Back at the community center, the mood was jubilant. Volunteers and marchers gathered to celebrate, sharing stories and congratulating one another. Malik was practically glowing as he recounted the day's events. "We did it, Ms. Walker," he said, his eyes shining. "This is going to change everything." Leona smiled, but her thoughts were already on the next steps. "It's a start, Malik, but change takes time. We have to stay focused." That evening, as the streets of Brookfield grew quiet, Leona sat alone in her office, reviewing footage and photos from the march. Her phone buzzed with a message from Renee. "You were incredible today. Rest up. You'll need your strength for what's next." Leona smiled faintly and set her phone down. She knew Renee was right. The march had been a victory, but the real work was just beginning. Outside, the flickering streetlights cast long shadows, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. The morning after the Unity March, Brookfield awoke to the aftermath of a day that would forever change the town. News outlets were flooded with coverage of the march, featuring interviews, videos of Leona's speech, and images of the massive crowd walking in solidarity. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForLeona and #BrookfieldUnited trended nationwide. But alongside the outpouring of support, there was a swell of backlash. Counter-protesters and critics accused the march of disrupting peace and painted Leona as a troublemaker, dividing the community. Leona, however, remained steadfast. At the community center, she met with her core team, Malik, Darius, Renee, and Reverend Davis, to strategize their next steps. The energy in the room was electric, but there was an underlying tension as well. "We need to capitalize on this momentum," Malik said, gesturing to his laptop, which displayed articles about the march. "People are finally paying attention." "I agree," Renee said, "but we also need to prepare for the pushback. They're already spinning this to make us look like the problem." Leona nodded, her face calm but resolute. "We stick to our message. Accountability, justice, and unity. They can twist our words all they want, but we have the truth on our side." Meanwhile, across town, Officer Rowe was fuming. The Unity March had only deepened his sense of isolation and anger. At a gathering of counter-protesters at a local diner, he vented his frustrations to a group of his supporters. "They're making me out to be some kind of monster," Rowe said, his voice low but intense. "All I did was stand up for myself, and now I'm the villain." An older man in the group, a former police officer named Hank, leaned forward. "You need to fight back, James. Don't let them destroy your reputation. If you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will." Rowe nodded, but his resolve was tinged with desperation. He felt the walls closing in, his once solid foundation crumbling beneath him. Back at the community center, Leona received an unexpected call from the mayor's office. The mayor wanted to meet with her privately to discuss the aftermath of the march and the town's next steps. Leona agreed, though she was wary of his intentions. The meeting took place in the mayor's office that afternoon. The room was filled with polished furniture and framed photos of the mayor with various dignitaries. He greeted Leona with a practiced smile, motioning for her to sit. "Leona," he began, "first, let me say that the Unity March was an impressive display of community engagement. It was inspiring." Leona raised an eyebrow. "But," the mayor sighed, leaning forward, "but we're getting a lot of heat from certain parts of the community. Business leaders, donors, even some city council members. They feel that this movement is creating instability. I'm under pressure to find a way to bring things back to normal." Leona's eyes narrowed. "Normal? Mayor, normal is what got us here. Normal is why people like me and my community have had to fight just to be heard. If you're looking for me to back down, you're wasting your time." The mayor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'm not asking you to back down. I just want to find a solution that works for everyone." Leona stood, her voice firm. "Then start by holding the police department accountable. Open the independent investigation, and make sure it's truly independent." As she left the mayor's office, Leona felt a surge of determination. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she couldn't afford to compromise. That evening, tensions reached a breaking point when a group of counter-protesters organized a rally outside the police station. They carried signs supporting Rowe and accusing the Unity March of anti-police propaganda. The crowd grew rowdy, with chants calling for Rowe's reinstatement and an end to what they saw as a witch hunt. Inside the police station, Chief Andrews watched the scene from his office window. Officer Miller knocked on the door and entered, his face etched with concern. "This is getting out of hand, Chief," Miller said. "We need to address this before someone gets hurt." Andrews nodded grimly. "You're right. I've already requested additional officers for crowd control, but we can't let this escalate." At the same time, Leona and her team were monitoring the situation from the community center. Malik paced the room, his frustration evident. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said. "They want us to react." "And we won't," Leona said firmly. "We'll respond, but not with anger. We'll respond with action." The next morning, Leona held a press conference in front of the community center. Flanked by local leaders and supporters, she addressed the growing tensions. "Our movement is not anti-police," she said. "It's pro-accountability. It's about ensuring that everyone in this town, regardless of their race or background, feels safe and respected. We will not be silenced by intimidation or fear." The press conference was met with praise from supporters and skepticism from critics. Rowe, watching the footage from home, felt his anger boil over. He slammed his fist on the table, muttering to himself, "She's not going to get away with this." As night fell, Brookfield felt like a town on the brink. The streets were quiet, but the tension was palpable. At the community center, Leona sat alone in her office, reviewing plans for a community dialogue event. Darius entered, carrying a cup of tea. "You should get some rest," he said gently. "You've been going non-stop." Leona smiled faintly. "I will. But there's still so much to do." Outside, the flickering streetlights cast long shadows on the empty streets. The Unity March had been a victory, but the battle for Brookfield's soul was far from over. The fallout from the march had laid bare the town's divisions, and the fight for justice was only beginning. The streets of Brookfield had grown quieter, but the tension was more intense than ever. It was the calm before a storm, and everyone in town could feel it. Protests and counter-protests had become a daily occurrence, and the media's presence amplified every conflict, turning Brookfield into a national symbol of division and resistance. Yet, beneath the surface, something else was brewing, something more dangerous. Leona spent her morning at the community center, meeting with her team. Malik had taken to organizing smaller events to engage the youth, while Renee and Darius worked on expanding the movement's reach beyond Brookfield. But the room was tense. The constant threats and backlash were beginning to take their toll. Renee, always the pragmatist, broke the silence. "Leona, we need to talk about security. Things are getting more dangerous, and we can't take any risks." Leona looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that too. But I don't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing us scared." "It's not about fear," Darius said firmly. "It's about being prepared. You're the face of this movement, Leona. If something happens to you, everything we've built could fall apart." Leona sighed, nodding reluctantly. "All right, let's make a plan. But I won't let fear dictate our actions." Later that afternoon, the town held its first official dialogue session, organized by the mayor and overseen by a neutral mediator. The room was packed with community members, activists, and police officers, including Chief Andrews and Officer Miller. Leona sat in the front row, flanked by Malik and Renee, while Rose sat in the back, his face a mask of resentment. The mediator began with a call for open, honest conversation. "This is a space for listening and understanding. Let's focus on solutions, not blame." Leona was the first to speak. She rose from her seat, her voice calm but resolute. "We need accountability, transparency, and reform. This isn't about blaming individuals. It's about fixing a system that has failed us all." Her words were met with applause from her supporters and grumbling from Roe's camp. When Roe was called to speak, he stood stiffly, his tone defensive. "I've served this town for years," he began, "and I've always done my job with integrity. What happened with Ms. Walker was blown out of proportion. I'm not the villain here." The room erupted into murmurs, and the mediator struggled to regain control. Malik leaned over to Leona, whispering, "He's just digging himself deeper." As the session continued, tensions escalated. A heated exchange between a young activist and an older resident devolved into shouting, forcing the mediator to intervene. Leona remained calm, but she could feel the fragile threads holding the dialogue together starting to fray. That evening, Brookfield's divide reached a boiling point. A group of counter-protesters, emboldened by Roe's defiance, gathered near the community center. Their chants were loud and hostile, and some carried torches, their flames flickering ominously in the night. Inside the center, Leona and her team watched nervously as the crowd grew larger. Malik paced back and forth, his fists clenched. They're trying to intimidate us. We can't just sit here and do nothing. We don't engage, Leona said firmly. That's what they want. We stick to our principles. But as the night wore on, the situation outside grew more volatile. Someone threw a rock through one of the center's windows, shattering the glass and sending a ripple of panic through the room. Malik rushed to the window, his voice filled with anger. This is too much. We can't just let them attack us like this. Leona placed a hand on his shoulder. We respond with strength, not violence. Call the police and document everything. The police arrived quickly, but their presence only seemed to escalate the tension. The counter-protesters hurled insults at the officers, accusing them of siding with the movement. Chief Andrews tried to calm the crowd, but the situation was spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, Roe watched the chaos from a distance, his mind racing. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. For the first time, he began to question whether his actions had been worth the cost. Inside the community center, Leona gathered her team. We need to prepare for the worst, she said. But we also need to remember why we're doing this. This isn't just about us. It's about the future of this town. The night ended without further violence, but the damage had been done. The shattered window became a symbol of the fragile state of Brookfield, a town teetering on the edge of chaos. Leona sat alone in her office, staring at the broken glass, her thoughts heavy. Across town, Rose sat in his darkened living room, the glow of the television casting shadows on his face. The news replayed footage of the confrontation outside the community center, framing it as a clash between two irreconcilable sides. Jason, his teenage son, entered the room hesitantly. "Dad," Jason said softly, "are you happy with how things are going?" Ro didn't answer immediately. He stared at the screen, his jaw tight. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad." Jason sat beside him. "Maybe it's not too late to fix it." Ro looked at his son, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. For the first time, he felt the cracks in his armor. The man who had always prided himself on control now felt powerless, his world unraveling around him. In the quiet of the night, Brookfield held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. But for Leona, the fight for justice was far from over. The breaking point had been reached, but the question remained. Would it lead to destruction or transformation? The aftermath of the shattered window lingered like a dark cloud over Brookfield. The community center had become a symbol of resilience, but also a flashpoint for the escalating tensions in the town. News outlets framed the incident as part of a broader cultural conflict, while social media buzzed with arguments from both sides. For Leona, every moment felt like a balancing act. One misstep could unravel everything she and her team had built. The morning began with an emergency meeting at the community center. Leona, Malik, Renee, Darius, and a few other core team members gathered in the main hall, their voices echoing in the quiet room. "We can't ignore what happened last night," Renee said, her tone urgent. "The fact that someone felt emboldened enough to throw a rock through our window is a sign that things are getting worse." Malik leaned forward, his fists clenched. "We need to call them out, Leona. Name them. Show the world who's really causing the chaos." Leona shook her head. "If we point fingers, we'll only give them more ammunition to paint us as the aggressors. We stay focused on our message: justice, accountability, and unity." Darius chimed in, his voice measured. "The mayor's office called this morning. They're asking for another dialogue session. They think it'll help calm things down." Leona considered this for a moment. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But this time, I'm going to set the terms. No more vague promises. We need concrete actions." Across town, Officer Rowe was spiraling. The shattered window had been the talk of the counter-protesters' rally that morning, and while some celebrated it as a victory, others felt it had gone too far. Rowe's internal conflict was growing, his sense of control slipping. In his living room, Jason confronted him again, his voice firm but pleading. "Dad, why are you still fighting this? You know what you did was wrong." Rowe turned to his son, his face lined with frustration and guilt. "It's not that simple, Jason. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." Jason stood his ground. "You're not the victim here, Dad. Cheers. And if you don't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem. The words cut deep, leaving Ro alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he began to question not just his actions, but the beliefs that had driven him to them. Later that day, the second dialogue session was held in the town hall. This time, the room was even more crowded, with residents, activists, counter-protesters, and media filling every seat. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken grievances. Leona sat at the front, flanked by Renee and Malik, while Ro sat on the opposite side, his posture defensive. The mediator began with a cautious tone. We're here to find common ground, to address the concerns of everyone in this room. Let's start with Ms. Walker. Leona stood, her voice steady despite the charged atmosphere. I'm here because I believe in this town. I believe we can be better. But that starts with accountability. Officer Ro's actions weren't just a personal attack on me. They were a reflection of a system that has failed to serve and protect all of its people equally. We need transparency. We need reform. Her words were met with applause from her supporters and murmurs from the counter-protesters. The mediator turned to Ro. Officer Ro, would you like to respond? Ro hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he stood, his voice quieter than anyone expected. I've been a police officer in this town for over a decade. I've always believed I was doing the right thing, protecting this community. But maybe I've been wrong. Maybe I let my own biases get in the way of what's right. The room fell silent, shocked by his admission. Leona's expression softened slightly, though she remained cautious. Ro continued, his voice breaking. I'm not proud of what I did to Ms. Walker. It was wrong, and I let my anger get the best of me. I'm sorry. The crowd erupted into whispers, the tension in the room shifting. Some counter-protesters looked uncomfortable, while others crossed their arms in defiance. Malik leaned over to Leona, whispering, Do you think he means it? I don't know, Leona replied quietly, but it's a start. The dialogue session ended with a mix of hope and skepticism. Ro's apology made headlines, sparking debates about whether it was genuine or simply damage control. For Leona, it was a step forward, but far from the end of the road. That evening, Leona returned to the community center, where a small group of supporters had gathered for a candlelight vigil. The flickering flames illuminated their faces, their expressions a mix of determination and exhaustion. Leona stood before them, her voice filled with quiet strength. We've come a long way, but the fight isn't over. This is about more than one man, one incident. It's about changing the way we see each other, the way we treat each other, and the way we build our future. And we will not stop until that future is brighter for everyone. The crowd erupted into cheers, their resolve renewed. As the vigil continued, Leona felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Across town, Ro sat alone in his car outside the police station, staring at the flickering streetlights. His apology had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it had also been a moment of clarity. For the first time, he began to see the world through a lens he had long ignored. But redemption would not come easily, and he knew his journey was just beginning. The sun rose over Brookfield, casting golden light over a town forever changed. The events of the past weeks had left an indelible mark, forcing residents to confront the stark divides that had long been ignored. But for the first time in years, there was a cautious sense of hope, a belief that perhaps change was possible. Leona stood on the steps of the community center, her eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered for the town's first community reconciliation forum. It was the culmination of weeks of work, a public space for open dialogue, healing, and planning for a shared future. The forum was held in the park, where the Unity March had ended. Rows of chairs were set up under a large tent, and booths surrounded the area, offering information on civic engagement, mental health resources, and ways to support local businesses. Darius approached, holding a clipboard and a cup of coffee. Everything's ready. You're the opening speaker. Leona smiled, her nervous energy tempered by the support around her. Let's make today count. As the forum began, residents trickled in, filling the seats. The mood was mixed. Some people were optimistic, others skeptical, But there was a shared understanding that this was a turning point. At the front, Leona took the microphone, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Good morning, Brookfield," she began, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "Today, we're here because we believe in this town. We believe in its potential, in its people, and in its future. But belief alone isn't enough. We need action, accountability, and above all, understanding." She spoke about the events that had brought them to this moment, from the Unity March to the recent dialogue sessions. She emphasized the need for systemic reform, urging the town to embrace uncomfortable truths and work toward meaningful change. Her words resonated, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. The next speaker was Chief Andrews, who had been hesitant to participate but ultimately recognized the importance of the forum. He spoke about the need for transparency in policing, announcing new measures to address community concerns, including the creation of a civilian oversight board. "Policing is a partnership," Andrews said, "and that partnership only works if there's trust. We have a long way to go, but I'm committed to making this department one the entire town can trust." The announcement was met with cautious applause, a sign that while the community appreciated the gesture, they remained vigilant. The most surprising moment came when Officer Rowe stepped forward. The crowd grew tense, and whispers rippled through the audience. Leona watched him closely, her expression unreadable. Rowe took the microphone, his posture uneasy. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it," he began. "But I need to take responsibility for my actions. What I did to Ms. Walker was wrong. It was driven by anger, fear, and ignorance. I let my biases control me, and I failed the community I was supposed to protect." The crowd was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He continued, his voice trembling. "I've decided to resign from the police force. I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I can work to be better, to understand, and to help rebuild the trust I've broken." A mix of reactions rippled through the audience. Some clapped, others remained stoic, and a few turned away in disgust. Rowe stepped down from the stage, his face pale but resolute. As he walked past Leona, their eyes met briefly. She gave him a small nod, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement of the first step toward accountability. The forum continued with breakout sessions, where residents discussed topics ranging from police reform to educational equity. Malik led a youth-focused session, energizing young people to get involved in activism and civic engagement. Renee facilitated a workshop on fostering dialogue between different groups, while Darius worked behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly. As the day went on, a sense of unity began to take hold. People who had once been on opposite sides of the divide found themselves sitting together, sharing stories and ideas. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still lingering resentments, but it was a start. At the end of the forum, Leona returned to the stage for the closing remarks. The crowd had thinned slightly, but those who remained were deeply engaged, their faces filled with a mix of hope and determination. "We've taken an important step today," Leona said. "But this is just the beginning. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's something we have to work for, day after day, together. I believe in this town, and I believe in all of you. Let's keep building, Brit by Brit, until Brookfield becomes the place we know it can be." The applause was thunderous, a sign that her words had struck a chord. As the crowd dispersed, Leona stood on the stage, taking in the scene. Malik approached, his grin wide. "We did it, Ms. Walker. This is the start of something big." Leona smiled, for he'd see. "Yes, it is, Malik. And we're just getting started." Across town, Rowe packed up his belongings at the police station for the last time. He felt a mix of relief and sadness, knowing he was leaving behind a career that had once defined him. But for the first time in years, he also felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he wanted to be part of the solution. That night, Brookfield was quiet, the tension that had gripped the town for so long beginning to ease. Leona sat in her office at the community center, surrounded by the faint hum of activity as volunteers cleaned up from the day's events. She looked out the window at the darkened streets, feeling a cautious but unshakable sense of hope. Brookfield wasn't fixed. It would take years, maybe decades, to fully heal the scars of its past. But the seeds of change had been planted, and Leona knew that as long as people continued to fight for justice, the town's future would be bright. And for the first time, it felt like Brookfield was truly beginning to find its way forward.